Welcome, everyone. I'm Sally Spencer Thomas, co-chair of the Workplace Suicide Prevention and Postvention Committee. And today's webinar is on law enforcement suicide prevention with a real emphasis on implementing peer support. Our guests today are the esteemed Chief John Morrissey, a 33-year-old veteran of Kenosha, Wisconsin's police department, who retired as chief of that department. He's served the Department of Justice in many different roles and currently also serves on the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. And he's also currently the Kenosha City Administrator. Our second esteemed guest is Govan A, who's currently the Executive Director and Chair of the Suicide Prevention Alliance, also a tenured veteran, 29 years in the Pennsylvania State Patrol, also retired. He has also served in a number of ways in promoting peer support within law enforcement, and he also is a loss survivor, having lost his brother to suicide. The National Guidelines for Workplace Suicide Prevention is a partnership between the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and United Suicide Survivors International. It is built upon 8 guiding principles, and in some of our other videos, you can learn more about those principles and how they are implemented. The guidelines also highlight these 9 practices that you can engage in to create a comprehensive and sustainable and impactful suicide prevention, mental health promotion program at your workplace. And they are organized into upstream preventive practices, midstream early intervention practices, and downstream crisis response practices. And now I'll turn it over to our guests to talk about the goals for this webinar.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Sally and Jody, for inviting myself and John to be on this panel to talk about law enforcement suicide. So our goal today is to establish the best practices for law enforcement suicide prevention that have been proven to work. And we want to create a comprehensive and sustained strategy, not just something that's simple and that works one year, doesn't work others. We have set forth minimum standards and training for our peer support programs and effective and positive messaging. So obviously the statement of the problem is law enforcement, suicide and law enforcement. We really believe that if we do the right thing, that we could really change the mindset of this problem in law enforcement. So here are the stats, what we know. And unfortunately, with what we know in these stats, they are not complete by any measure. So in 2021, we know that we've lost 138 people to suicide. And this is the first year in probably the last 5 to 6 years that actually suicides have not outnumbered those officers that are killed in the line of duty. The average range for those who die by suicide in law enforcement is between 40 and 50. The average age of services who died from suicides is 16 to 17 years. 87% of those suicides were by male officers. 27% of police suicide victims were military veterans. However, in the data that's collected, it's usually collected through Blue Hope and the National Law Enforcement Memorial Foundation, who collect this data on Google, or volunteers on some police departments that will send in the data to these organizations. However, we probably really believe that this could easily be doubled, unfortunately, because we still have this stigma of reporting suicide in law enforcement. These 3 pictures are here from the insurrection. And we know that suicides can result from trauma that happens in law enforcement. And I want to read you the 4 names that have died by suicide since the Capitol insurrection: Jeff Smith, Howard Liebengood, Gunther Hashida, and Kyle DeFreitek. And anecdotally, I've heard that actually 2 more have died by suicide since those 4 names. And we need to do better, especially in incidents such as this, which that was at the Capitol, but there are other incidents that trauma does occur. So here are the unique risk factors that occur. The stigma for reaching out for help, that's huge. Law enforcement officers like to keep things close to the vest. They're not sure there's any confidentiality, even amongst their friends and family in law enforcement. So they're looking at the stigma that's involving and the blame and how people feel about reaching out for mental health assistance. Easy access to firearms. Those in law enforcement have firearms. They carry them every day. And usually they have not only one gun, but several guns, and some of them are at home. There's usually substance use issues that result from what we do and how to relieve the stress, poor coping skills. Investigation leads to shame and isolation. So actually people don't go anywhere and people actually that work with people who are under investigation really don't kind of ignore them or shun them, and which leads to shame and isolation. Significant exposure to trauma. Depending on those bigger departments, critical incidents and traumatic incidents can happen every day. So again, and a lot of things aren't done with that. There's not a lot of critical incident or traumatic incident aftermath and making sure those officers are okay. Sleep disruption, we always have, unfortunately, we're working shifts anywhere from 12-hour shifts to 8-hour shifts, and it's usually not on a regular shift. It could be, you could be working 8 to 4 one day, 4 to 12 midnight shift in a 3-day period. And as in all suicides, there's usually relationship issues. And that seems, again, in my experience, to be one of the number one issues. But as we all know, suicide is not just one issue, it's multiple issues, and which some of them are stated here. January 1st, 2022, the FBI starts to collect data for information on suicides and attempted suicides based on some of the following: circumstances and events which occurred before each suicide or suicide attempt, location of each suicide or attempted suicide, demographic information of law enforcement officer who dies or attempts suicide, occupational category for including criminal investigators, corrections officers, line of duty, death, 9/11 dispatch operators, and those law enforcement officers who dies or attempts suicide. The method in each suicide or attempted suicide. The problem with collecting this data, which is a start, is that law enforcement departments aren't mandated to report it. The FBI might collect it, but each department does not have to share their suicide information. This is, I think, one of the best slides that you can use this in any workplace. It's a comprehensive framework for law enforcement suicide prevention that we want in every framework and dealing with this, any organization. Create a culture that supports mental health, mitigate the impact of trauma and cumulative stress, disseminate safe and positive messages, building a resilience and healthy coping skills. Again, so we don't turn to like alcohol or some usually things that would denigrate the person's job status. Normalize and increase help-seeking behaviors, improve access and decrease barriers to mental health care, identify and assist persons at risk, strengthen supports and connections. One of the most important things that we need to do is provide support to all officers after a suicide death or an attempt has occurred in the workplace. Develop and strengthen peer supports, which myself and John really believe that is really one of the number one things that does work within law enforcement, and prepare and provide support during the transitions. Proven ways that do make a difference. Peer support programs, as I said, that, I believe and John believes that is the number one thing that can really show a difference. Critical incident stress management programs that will talk to those officers after those traumatic incidents. Chaplain programs and mandatory training involving suicide prevention and critical incident stress. One of the things that we do know, unfortunately, is that out of the 18,000 police departments that exist across the country, only about 5% have mandatory training in suicide prevention and critical incident stress. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Govan. I appreciate that, and I agree with you 100%. I think peer support is one of the major interventions that is there. It's an early intervention, I think, and I think we all agree that early intervention in suicide prevention programs is there. So what really is a peer support team? It's a specialized trained colleague. It's not a counselor. It's not a therapist. It's individuals that are in the same field that you're in. And this can work for all kinds of organizations, not just law enforcement. We always make sure that we let people know that peer support programs augment. They don't replace EAPs. They don't replace in-house treatment programs, but they're very early intervention. So the peer support team member is trained to provide both day-to-day emotional support for departments, as well as participate in these comprehensive response to critical incidents. There's training that you need for, as you mentioned, CISM training earlier, I think chaplain programs. But when a peer talks to another peer after a critical incident, or quite frankly, even about their day-to-day things, that early intervention really sets the tone of, I think, how this individual responds and how they respond as a department. We need to remember that peer support team member is trained to recognize and refer cases that actually require professional intervention or are beyond the scope of training to a licensed mental health professional. All departments should have those mental health professionals already identified prior to starting a peer team. Some critical things to make your peer team successful is who you select for that team. It's critical success to the program that the individuals selected are there for the right reasons. This isn't a resume builder. This isn't somebody who wants to know everybody's business. This is somebody who cares and understands that. But you need to open it up to all employees and have a very diverse cross-section to make sure that we represent all the employees that work in your division. And that can include civilians, that can include sworn, it can include individuals that, you know, are contracted. You need to make sure how the interaction works there. Important for peer team is to make sure there's a clear understanding of whether the conversations are privileged, whether they're confidential, whether they have to be disclosed. But a proper peer team will disclose that prior to ever engaging with their fellow employees. Is there something I think we really need to do, and this is becoming more and more common, is pursue state laws specifically dealing with conversations that are protected. My preference is that they become privileged, similar to priest or religious things. But if you can't get there, at least confidentiality. Again, one of the concerns that most officers have is the conversation going to be something that's brought out in a police and fire commission hearing, court, those kind of things. So again, setting those rules, getting those policies up front really strengthens this. You have to emphasize the importance of that partnership. There should always be an oversight by a trusted, vetted, and culturally competent mental health professional. Those are the individuals that, when peer can no longer assist or needs to refer out, this is the individual they can go to. They need to be comfortable with that person, that they're understanding the profession that they're dealing with. This is also extremely important, I believe, is the message that you send. So my question says, does messaging about suicide matter? I absolutely think it does. Research has clearly shown that messaging about suicide can either increase the risk of suicide and undermine your prevention efforts, or promote the positive behaviors and support prevention goals. So the words you use, they matter. The way a police agency talks about suicide has a significant impact on preventing suicides and encouraging help-seeking behavior for those who may be in crisis. The message should be that you're going to come back, you'll be healthier. You know, it's got to be a wellness resilience message. Again, I have peers in here because that's that unique opportunity to break through the skepticism, challenge when a peer shares their personal experience with mental health, substance abuse, suicide attempt. It can combat that challenge of silence that exists around these issues. Again, I have peers here sharing their experiences, but not making it become about them. It's how they got through those. It's not to relive theirs, but their similar and challenging things they went through is what a peer does. Share the stories of healing and recovery. That's the most powerful thing your department will have. Those individuals will become the ambassadors for the department, for the peer support team. We all have to believe suicide can be prevented when it's talked about in a safe, positive, and effective way. Here are the key components that we have when messaging. Strategy. Be upfront, thinking about planning that message ahead of time so it can succeed. Avoid potentially harmful messaging content. You know, cops by nature are interested in the details, or that's really not the message that should be out there. It's how we can overcome this, how we can be healthier, how we can move forward. Share those positive stories. Messages that promote help seeking are the most important. Again, the peer support members or the individuals in your department who have experienced it and come out and talk about it are going to be your best ambassadors to bring those forward. Put guidelines together. Utilize specific messaging guidelines, recommendations. You have to realize when you're messaging who the audience is. Is it an outside? Is it internal? Is it the media? But you need to think about all those things. After you have a suicide, it's not the time to be thinking about how my message is going to be. So we think some action steps and resources that you should take as follows. What should you do? First off, you need to recognize suicide as a problem, but that it's preventable. Implement a peer support program and provide the fiscal and administrative support for that program to succeed. I say put 3 to 5 years into it from the beginning, realizing that the first couple of years may not be as successful as you think. It's going to take time for that trust to be built in those departments, but from the top down, there has to be a commitment. It can't be, this is a 1 year, let's try it. So make sure that support for that program to succeed is there. Learn and practice is safe and positive messaging. You can send out messages, you can practice it and see how they're responded to by the officers internally. You'll get feedback. Establish those policies and procedures early. Biggest thing you can do is develop a strategy of what you're going to do in your department going forward. And these 2 pages, this one and the next one, will just list a lot of resources. We think, the Safe Call Now, the COP line, frontline help, and then messaging, peer support guidelines through the IACP. You'll see the IACP on here a lot. Govan had that in his presentation. They've done a remarkable job going forward on this. Breaking the Silence, National Consortium on Preventing Law Enforcement Suicide. There's a good study out there, the Ruderman study, if you wish to do it. Blue Help, and then law enforcement suicide data collection, which is what Govan talked about. So these are resources we think are valuable in helping get things going. Clearly on the IACP site there, clearly on the workplace suicide prevention, there's a lot more resources as well.
Thank you so much, John and Govan, for this incredibly helpful conversation. You've been leading the way in peer support as a workplace for decades, and so the rest of the industries are looking at you for that leadership. To all of you listening, please take action today. Take the pledge, go to workplacesuicideprevention.com and become one of our pledge partners by taking the pledge, and you'll learn much more about the 9 practices in the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention.